Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. Where are the orphans of the world? Are they only overseas? Well, in the U.S. foster care system, there are actually 120,000 adoptable orphans. And our guest today has a very interesting solution to this age-old problem. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Kerry Hasenbalg, co-founder of the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute, an informational source to members of the U.S. Congress concerning adoption and the needs of orphans and foster children. Welcome, Kerry.
Thanks for having me.
That sounds like an exciting thing that the Congress is doing. We hear lots of things about what Congress is not doing. So it's good to hear that they're doing something for orphans and foster children. How did it get started?
Well, the caucus, the actual coalition, existed since 1985, and the members organized themselves, but they didn't have a staff. And so I came on board to be their staff, and we spun off into an actual organization because they had people that could help them do what they really wanted to do.
What was a day-to-day like for you?
It was never the same. In general, on a regular basis, we answered questions from members of Congress as they sought to write legislation and speak on the issue of caring for orphans and foster children. But we also did programs where we would use their platforms to make a difference. And what we ended up finding out was when we could get actual children involved with them, they wrote better policy.
Right. So like most people, you have a general sense of what it might be like to be a foster child in the United States or an orphan internationally. Right. But it is pretty shallow. So is your organization able to give some depth to this conversation?
Yes, I think it made a very profound difference. One of the first things we ever did when I came on board was we created what we called a foster care maze in the Rayburn House office building. We had members of Congress walk through the maze and find out what it might be like to be caught in the foster care system and not being able to get out. And that got us rolling into more creative programs that made the members of Congress start to feel what it might be like to be a foster child themselves.
So how frustrated did they get when they hit wall after wall after wall or couldn't control some of the things that happened on their lives? What was that like for congressmen and women?
Well, for them to give their time to come and do it, and then for them to go through something so frustrating, they actually began to really care. And what was interesting was I got my very first intern out of that experience because Senator Landrieu, when she got to the end of the maze, there were a group of children who had aged out of foster care there. And she said, "Is this really what it's like?" And got talking with some of them and hired one of them and said, "This is your intern for the summer." So,
fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So there was real solid action items that came out of this, what kind of a think tank educational situation.
Correct, yeah, it did.
So let's talk about the international scene, then we'll go and talk about U.S. scene as well. What is a definition of an orphan?
Well, most people think of the term orphan meaning that a child's mom and dad passed away, but it can mean that they chose to relinquish their parental rights, or their parental rights were relinquished because they weren't fit parents. When we use the number 143 million orphans worldwide, that term actually means fatherless or motherless children. They may have only lost one parent, when in reality a double orphan means they've lost both parents, and that's estimated at maybe around 30 million children worldwide.
You're talking 30 million children worldwide have no parents.
That's what it's estimated about.
And
yeah.
Is that a growing number?
In some senses, the numbers remained about static, but the reasons they're orphaned changes based on world conflicts, HIV, AIDS, just economies, different economies, that sort of thing.
Why should the United States be concerned about this parentless child?
Well, on the one hand, there's the issue of what God has to say. But before we get to that, I think just the practical reality that children who aren't raised properly, and by properly, children need to be raised by families, not governments. Governments do not do a good job raising children. Those children very often end up as delinquent children and not able to be productive members of society, and then we end up having to care for them as adults, and they can't actually be functioning members of society.
So the sort of inculcation of values that you would want your child to have, education, healthcare, love, the kinds of things that make a person a good civic individual, those things could be lacking if we don't care for individuals who don't have two parents or one parent, because perhaps one parent children don't get that kind of needs met either. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, I think that for absolute certain, a child without both parents, they don't. They're not, they don't end up as functioning members of society usually unless there's a miracle, and that's usually because the church stepped in and somebody acted as a parental guidance for that child. But there's a term that's used called dual jackets, which is children who are raised by the state and end up being put away in prison by the state. They're known as dual jackets, and there's a lot of them in our prisons. There's a lot of them abroad. Children who grow up as orphans end up getting into trouble usually because they need money. They need to get food, and they end up getting in trouble with the government.
So we spend, as a U.S. government, a lot of money on national security. And in some ways, this feels to me like a national security issue.
That argument has absolutely been made, and I agree with it.
Right.
Wise woman.
Well, because we keep saying, where are all the terrorists coming from? Where are all the individuals who have no rootedness come from? Why are they willing to kill themselves? And perhaps it's because they don't have anything to live for.
Well, there's absolutely terrorist groups that target children who are orphaned in orphanages, or children who end up in, as a result of a massive conflict in the Sudan, for instance, in northern Uganda, what's gone on there, a destabilized land where children are losing their parents, are breeding grounds for little terrorists to be indoctrinated, truly.
So what are the good programs? What's working internationally, and what has the U.S. Have they supported those kinds of good programs?
Well, the United States has a large number of really good organizations working in this country and abroad to make a difference for orphans around the globe. I would say that I'm most impressed with faith-based organizations, to be quite honest, because they there's just an extra strength there. I mean, it's really the strength of God, I think.
Right. Yes, of course it is.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are motivated for various reasons to be involved with parentless children. And certainly the Bible speaks about caring for those who are fatherless and motherless, the orphan amongst us. It also makes us better people. You know,
Yes.
when we care for something greater than our own immediate needs, we are blessed by that.
That's right. That's right. I mean, when we really look at the end of the story, God's preparing a bride, and he says he's the father to the fatherless.
Right.
And if we're his bride, that would make us mom, I guess. So, I mean, in reality, God really wants to sanctify us. He wants, and it's through sacrifice. And God is saying, I want you to join me in this work, in this kingdom building work. And, you know, in the Word, when God himself defines religion, which is what we should do while we're still here to bless him. He says, true religion that I accept is to first and foremost care for orphans and widows and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. We get a lot of sermons on how to not do and not be like the world. But God didn't start with that. He started with care for orphans because I'm calling you to, and I want you to.
Be my extension.
That's right.
In the world.
That's right. That's sort of an area that the Lord has brought me into after I left the coalition and went on to work with Johanna's Hope. Some of the interns for what we had working on Capitol Hill that were former foster kids ended up finding out, because they had ended up in foster care because they had been refugees from Africa. One was from Rwanda, and two of them ended up being from the Sudanese conflict. Mm-hmm. One young man actually ended up here in Michigan, who was a Sudanese lost boy going through the Bethany foster care program. And I met him as an adult when he was interning on Capitol Hill. I told him we were hiring him for this job, and he didn't seem very excited. And I said, I thought you wanted this job. And he said, well, I just found out that my dad's alive in the Sudan.
No.
I was going to Africa, to northern Uganda. He told me that his dad was in a refugee camp in northern Uganda. We invited him to go with us when we were going with Stephen Curtis Chapman. We had his father come and meet us, his father and his brother. We were there. Walked into the guest house we were staying. This young man named Adir was standing there. And we introduced the father to his son.
Oh, wow.
The father put his hands up in the air and said in Arabic, which was later translated for me, only God sees what is invisible. But today God has allowed me to see that which has been invisible, my own son.
That's just an amazing story. It brings tears to both of our eyes as we're sitting here, because you as a parent, myself as a parent, we're thinking, what would it be like to meet up with someone who you thought was dead and gone and never to, and then almost like a rebirth to see them? And how many years had it been?
It's been more than a decade.
More than a decade. So this had been a boy who was maybe 10 or 11,
yes,
and now as a grown man, and he had made his way,
yes,
you know, in the world through the help of many people.
Yes.
Which is what part of what the coalition is doing, is saying, look, get involved.
Yes.
Now, sometimes there are abuses with adoption situations, and I know that the Hague recently passed a number of laws,
yes,
in order to stop some trafficking or some illegal, yes, activity. Do you think that that's been a positive set of rules and regulations?
I am a huge proponent of the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption and Protection of Children, because I got involved in this work when Russia, the government of Russia at the federal level, was looking to talk to the U.S. government about some problems that happened with children that were adopted here. And our U.S. government kept saying, talk to our states, talk to our agencies. And so I think because we lagged so long in not ratifying the Hague and not becoming a full party, it's hurt us as a country. And really the Hague is just getting on one world system. We're on one world system. We have contracts for everything else that goes across country lines, but children, we had no system really.
So if you wanted to make a complaint, for instance, what if you were an adoptive family and you had paid some money, maybe it was to an unscrupulous person who was a broker for an adoption,
right,
or the agency closed after they got your money, who would you have complained to?
Before, you would complain to the agency, or the agency's closed, nobody can complain to you. But you wouldn't have gotten an answer. Now you can actually go to the State Department, who is now the central authority under the Hague Convention, and file a formal complaint. And they are now required to look into it. And if the adoption agency that is accredited under the Hague Convention was found to have done something unscrupulous, truly, then the State Department can revoke their license and they cannot continue to work in those countries.
Has there been any negative effect, which is that some countries that are poor in resources have had to shut down legitimate but unlicensed agencies?
Legitimate and
but unlicensed. You know, they just didn't do the paperwork. They're caring for children. These children need to be adopted, but they didn't have all the I's dotted, the T's crossed, and now they're out of business.
Yes, I mean, it absolutely is happening. There's a lot of things that are happening that I wish weren't happening. There's a lot of things not happening that should be happening, where there's people that shouldn't be working that are, and people that, you know, aren't.
So it's going
to
take a while.
It does. Yeah, it is going to take a while.
But it was for the protection of children.
Yes.
Has it increased the cost of things now that the Hague Convention rules and regulations are in place?
I wouldn't say by anything significant. I mean, it's taken some extra work for agencies to get accredited, but I think it's so important for adoptive families to know that they're going to have someone to call if something goes wrong. I mean,
what were some of the problems that this convention was trying to eradicate? What were was there human trafficking of children going on?
Yes, there was some.
There was?
Yes.
Okay, so under the guise of adoption, people were actually using children in an illegal way.
Yes, and I don't think it was as overt as that, but there was, I know cases, and I worked with this at the Coalition, where families were going over to adopt a certain child, and that child had passed away, and there were facilitators that went and got another child, used the old birth certificate of the dead child, and sent the child home. I mean, there was that kind of work going on, and then there was no one to talk to when things went wrong, or a family went over to a country and was there, and it turns out that there was no child for them, and they got stuck in a hotel for weeks and weeks and being extorted for money. There was just money going over, and it wasn't going for what it was supposed to. A lot of that.
And when you're dealing with a child, and when you're a parent and you're hoping to bring home a child, I think that my gut is that you would overlook some irregularities in order to make that connection happen.
Yes, and the concept of the ends justify the means. Well, at least this child got a home.
Right.
But in reality, it's hurting all the people that are coming after you. Just because you wanted to go a little bit more quickly, so you paid a little bit more money, now the child's home, but the person after you has to pay that little bit more money too.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Now, let's talk about the U.S. system. This is where we are at.
Right.
And we have foster care systems, so I guess we don't have any orphans.
Well, they are our orphans.
Yes.
Yes. And it's interesting, in the government books, that they still use the word orphan. It's just that it makes a child, it's taken on a very negative connotation, the word orphan. And so we use the word foster children because we're fostering them in this country, kind of. But they're real orphans.
Now, instead of being adopted at birth, or maybe they've been relinquished later on in their life, maybe 3 or 4, is that why they get into the foster system, or do they get in as babies, teens? How do children get into the foster system? I
think it's not unlike how it happens in other countries, honestly. Sometimes parents relinquish their children at birth. Sometimes a lot of abuse and neglect, a lot of drug issues. It could be imprisonment. It could be simply that mom and dad passed away, or just one parent passed away and the other parent couldn't take care of them. I mean, all sorts, a whole gamut of reasons that children come into foster care, but there's over 500,000 children at any given time in the U.S. foster care system. And of those children, about 120,000, give or take a few, are currently available and considered waiting children to find adoptive families.
Okay, so you're talking about 120,000 children.
Yes.
And how many people do we have in the United States?
300 million.
300 million?
Yeah. That's a trick question.
Yeah. But it seems as if with 300 million people and really 120,000 children, this doesn't seem like a problem that is insurmountable.
No, they say the amount of churches that are in this country, I mean, I guess if one church took one child, it wouldn't be a matter. I know that's the case I just was reading Bethany Christian Services statistics. They have a program called Open Arms, where they are the largest adoption agency in the nation, reaching out to churches to get churches to take some of these waiting children. And I guess there's 6,000 of the 18,000 children in Michigan alone are considered waiting children, adoptable children. If there's 10,000 churches here.
And there's a lot of churches in every state.
In every state. So here it's not even every church has to take one child.
And the idea behind the Open Arms is that not only will one family be the primary responsible family, but the church commits to saying to that family, you're not on your own.
Right.
We'll help with maybe financial. Right. We'll help with if you need a break. We'll be the brothers and sisters. We'll make sure that that child feels that there's a home. Because every adoption is not just an easy street.
Right.
Right.
Oh.
I mean, you
need respite care. You need financial help. I mean, my Johannes Hope, the organization my husband works with.
And who has founded that?
Stephen Curtis and Mary Beth Chapman, the gospel music singer. They saw that there are these children that need families. There's families who want to adopt them, but sometimes the finances were the barrier. And so Mary Beth started personally writing checks. Stephen said, we need a little help with this. And so that Johannes Hope started. And so there's
Johanna is their daughter, who is an adopted daughter.
Their first adopted daughter, yes.
Yeah. So they are now a funding agency, so that if you had the heart to adopt, but you didn't have the finances, and we know that an international adoption can cost tens of thousands of dollars.
Yes.
Does it cost something to adopt a U.S. child?
It can. If you adopt privately, it can, or it can cost a little bit even for foster care. But most foster care adoptions are either free or subsidized. But then there's post-adoption services. There's just a lot involved. And so I think there's a lot of roles that people can play, sort of the one body, many parts kind of thing, that if you can't adopt, if you don't have room maybe, or you're not at the age where you're going to be able to be around to raise the children long term, you can support people who are adopting or fostering, mentoring. I mean, I've seen churches have profound impact on children who age out of foster care and just need somebody to teach them how to live life. So
this 120,000 children, I'm just sort of stunned by the fact that this is a solvable problem if people would put their resources together. And people think that churches are good hubs of people to do this. Is there any evidence that that's true?
I think all the evidence is there. I mean, the reality is that we who are believers in churches, we love God. And we say, what do you want from us, God? You've given us all these things. What do you want from us? And he'll say, I want you to take care of my little ones. And so when the one that you love so much and you're so grateful for is asking you for one thing, consider the poor.
Right.
I think that's really a huge motivator. And also the fact that, I mean, Rick Warren talks about how churches are the largest distribution network on the planet.
And Rick Warren is the Saddleback minister who wrote Purpose-Driven Life.
Right.
We've seen him on TV in different arenas. And he's on this issue as well?
Yes. Yeah, he's doing a peace plan, I guess, to Africa. And one of the things he talks a lot about is that, I mean, it's a continent of orphans at some level, and we can't ignore this issue. It's affecting all of us, and we're in a global economy, we're in a global society, and it's affecting all of us. And the church really is the answer. God didn't design Uncle Sam to raise children. He designed the church. And I was reading in Psalm 68:5. And I was reading in it because I was struggling with where's God for the suffering.
Right.
And because he says, I'm the father to the fatherless over and over again. It says, I'm the father to the fatherless in his holy dwelling. But it says he doesn't dwell in houses made with hands. He dwells in his people. So he's calling his people united to come together.
Right.
One person can't do it all.
Right.
For sure.
Is there a church or a city in Texas that has actually put this to operational level?
I actually heard about, and I met the pastor from Possum Trot, Texas.
All right, great name.
Yes, and Focus on the Family actually did a book about this whole phenomenon where it was a tiny church. I mean, I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but it was just maybe 300
people. Not a mega
people.
church.
No, tiny church.
Right.
And the pastor, the Lord got hold of his heart on this issue about doing true religion, not just being here only, and realized there's these children. They adopted some 100 children in their small little church. And we were just talking earlier about one church just adopting one child, we'd solve the problem.
They adopted 100 children.
I think it was a large number, yes.
Well, now, one of the things that could be a positive piece of that is when you're the only one in any group, you can often feel different. If you are one of many and can look around and say, they not only loved me, they loved
That's right.
a lot of individuals who are like me,
Right.
and they are committed to me and to the other individuals.
Right.
There's something powerful about that.
Yes.
Plus, I would think that you would get some systems in place, right? So that this
Yes.
would be your church's ministry.
Yes, and there's a Cry of the Orphan is a campaign of Focus on the Family, Family Life, and Show Hannah's Hope. They came together to reach out to churches around the nation to say, here are the things that you can do. And if you go on that website and you look and see what are the possibilities of how I can get involved.
So what do you think are the obstacles to individuals, and I would think this applies to churches, synagogues, mosques, people who want to act out of a bigger belief system could adopt foster children. What are the obstacles to people of faith doing that?
Well, I think it was the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption that did a survey that talked about what the obstacles were. And one of the number one obstacles was the worry about finances, of how to actually finance the adoption. And people don't know that you can adopt out of foster care for free or nearly free. So a lot of it's misperceptions.
Okay.
I think also the feeling of what if there's problems, who's going to be there to help me? And so the fact that there's post-adoption services out there that people don't know about. So again, education.
I think the post-adoption services piece is one that if people had more information about, they may be more willing to say, I am as good as the foster care system, and it's my responsibility to open up my home. I have the time, I have the willingness, I have the love for another human being. But what if, something goes badly wrong? Then what? It seems so final.
Right. And I think people don't know that they have a support system. And I think for churches, if from the pulpit, the pastor or in other, faith-based places, if they would say, we're here for you, God's calling you to do this, but he's calling all of us to be a part and to support you. There was another obstacle that was interesting to me. The Ad Council some years ago did these PSAs they ran called You Don't Have to Be a Perfect Parent to adopt and to foster. And I thought that's part of it. Apparently people think I have to be perfect.
Well, I don't have the wherewithal to parent a child who might have special needs.
Right. Or
who am I to say that I could be a foster parent? I started putting myself on a parent pedestal. Right?
Right.
Okay. So if they're saying, look, come along, we'll come alongside you, you come along this system, and we'll get this done.
Right. And I think the paperwork and the process and how to go about it is daunting for some people. We actually put together a website called howtoadopt.org that'll just walk you through the process without telling you which agency or what kind of adoption. It just sort of points you to all the different resources.
So it's wonderful to be concerned about the international child, and that's a wonderful thing. And yet we have to look in our own backyard.
Yes.
For those 120,000 children who are right now saying, could I come into your home?
Yes.
Right? Could you be a set of parents for me?
Yes.
And changing one life, think about it. Changing one life could make the difference forever.
Yes, that's truly a miracle. Stephen Curtis uses the term miracle of adoption all the time, and it really is a miracle. I actually was given the opportunity with the members of Congress that I worked for to travel to China and meet with Jiang Zemin, the then president of China. And we were sitting there talking with him, and I remember the senator we were with was talking about how in, Slidell, Louisiana, they're celebrating Chinese New Year.
Right.
And we ended up talking about how these children are like mini amazing ambassadors for these foreign nations, and to see the president of China's face light up, and he said, this is a win-win for us on an international scale.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
My guest today has been Kerry Hasenbalg, adoption activist and co-founder of the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.